In recent years, news media is reporting that Americans are having less sex, describing this as a sex apocalypse. For this and many other reasons, I decided to write about sexual ecologies in the algorithmic age for my dissertation project, and this presentation is about Chapter 2, in which I've argued that since the origin of the United States, there has been a mechanization of humans. My name is Bernadette Bowen. I just defended my dissertation successfully a couple weeks ago, and my lifelong name is Bird. I'm at Bowling Green State University, so this is my presentation about the second chapter of said dissertation. So the main arguments of my dissertation, before I get into these, I wanted to give you a little backstory about what inspired me to do this project, other than the sex apocalypse. So I actually, in the first semester of being here, I took an intro to media and communication course and learned about a field called media ecology, and it really intrigued me. I'll talk about that more later. But later that semester, I saw a device on Kickstarter called the Love Sync. And it was basically these two buttons that a presumably monogamous couple sets on their bedside table. And if they're interested in having sex, they hit the button. And if it doesn't alert their partner unless they hit the button too, and then it lights up and it notifies each partner that they want to have sex. And I thought, this is really interesting because they described the need for the device as that humans have sexual syncing issues. And I thought, what does it mean? So I decided to kind of put these two things together. And the main arguments of my dissertation is that for quite some time now, consumer capitalism has framed both sex and love through a lens of economics. And secondly, advertising has capitalized on sexual identities of all types, and also the insufficient sex education system in the United States. And then lastly, the different forms of inhumanities that are built into the system as features. Another really interesting thing that's come about in the last 50 or so years particularly is that more and more businesses are profiting from both ageist and colorblind rhetorics of empowerment. So for instance, a brand, Liberatory, which is the advertisements that I analyze in my overall project, they're selling sex tech as if it is feminine empowerment. So I thought, after seeing both of these things, whoa, what might a combined theoretical framework of critical feminist rhetorical studies, discourse studies, and media ecology bring to these discussions of sexual ecologies? Before I get into that, I want to give a brief overview of media ecology. So as a field, what it did, it as in the many theorists like Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman and Christine L. Nystrom, who's lesser known, as well as Walter Ong, they talked about the ways that certain technologies make differences that make a difference when they're introduced into society. So for instance, McLuhan argued that the telephone extends our sense of hearing, but in the process of doing that, it auto-amputates our sense of hearing in our immediate surroundings. And so any type of technology or medium has that type of effect when introduced. There's also another really famous theory called laws of media that McLuhan created, or otherwise known as the tetrad. And he says that when introduced into society, technologies enhance, they obsolesce something, they retrieve something, and then they reverse something. So over the course of this dissertation, I argue that there's been a mechanization of humans that's now flipping into a humanization of objects because it's been pushed to its extreme. I'll get into that at the very end. What I think most is useful about this particular approach is that it considers the interconnectedness or the ecological implications of our world in a way that specialized academic disciplines oftentimes miss. And then lastly, the really important term that I appreciate from this field is breakdown as breakthrough. So the idea that we understand best how something works when it breaks down and we can see. And I think this has a lot of really important implications for critical cultural studies being introduced into the field as well. So just to give a little recap of the very first chapter, since I'm going to be focusing on the second predominantly in this presentation, is this quote by Janine Marchessault from the mid-2000s. She says, "It is women's experiences that have disappeared and what McLuhan identifies as a drive to push the boundaries of physical experience beyond the body. Women's bodies, the primary and original commodity." In post-war America, these bodies are advertised through glamour cake postures and highly charged displays of affect and melodrama. Through rhetorical ploy, moving emotion, and merchandise, subjectivities are invited to obey the law of numbers figured not by the folk, but rather in the laboratory, the studio, and advertising agency. So this speaks heavily to the overall project, as you can guess. So anyway, in moving into chapter 2, which is the entire histography of United States contexts, I go over 4 main things predominantly. So colonialism, rhetorics that were popular in colonial times, industrialisms, rhetorics that were popular in industrial times, and discourses, and then globalization, so the expansion of industrialisms through the feminization of labor and the transnational and global expansions, and then most recently neoliberalism in the last 50 years. So let's get into this, and of course how it affected advertising. So first off, we've got colonialism. So thinking back to the beginning of the United States, we can't talk about that without talking about the creation of whiteness. And so what we know about United States citizenship when it began is that the creation of whiteness was only, allowed for a very limited group of people, particularly white cishet men, were allowed to be fully citizens and also deemed fully human based on the Enlightenment subject. So these same figures, of course, were then deemed canon. They were deemed legitimate authority figures who were credible to not just be full citizens, but also be fully human. And what these people did on the basis of colonial enlightenment and manifest destiny types of rhetorics is they weaponized rhetorics of progress to basically, on the basis of anti-blackness and all forms of discrimination, dehumanize anyone that didn't meet that criteria. And so ultimately what this did is it equated to a false but very effective ideological and material sense an equation of Eurocentrism with civility, and then labeled anyone that didn't meet that criteria as less than human, or oftentimes specifically primitive or savages. So this still, of course, lingers today. So next we have Rhetorics of Industrialism. And really there's 3 main ones that I'll go over. But Rhetorics of Rationality was extensively written about by Weber, who talked about the ways in which emotion was replaced with logic and feeling was replaced with thinking. And of course, thinking back to the previous colonial rhetorics, it borrows a lot of the same mentalities, and because the same canons were used to uphold rhetorics of industrialism, or at least those who looked like them and thought like them, it was a pretty seamless transition because industrialism was quite literally built on top of colonialism. Next, we also have rhetorics of efficiency because, of course, what allows a hierarchy to function in a bureaucracy is standardization and efficiency. And then, of course, we also have innovation, scientific innovation, technological innovation, anything that's new and based in these ways of thinking and being were deemed superior to preceding, lesser, aggrandized ways of thinking and being. And then, of course, we always have individualism as well. That's something that's been a mainstay in when it comes to imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. So all of these rhetorics are really predominant in the advertising sector. And if anyone's ever seen the show Mad Men, I'm sure you've seen a good amount of this pass along your screens as well. And predominantly, again, the experts that were considered to be quotable in advertising and the appeals that they used, they speak to these logics as well. So eventually the 1900s rolled around and transnational capitalists were interested in finding a cheaper labor workforce. So they decided to feminize the labor force. And for better or worse, of course, this labor force has drastically transformed the ways in which we exist. Predominantly, of course, this brought in white feminine folks or feminine non-men that weren't in labor before, because of course black and brown folks were always in the labor force regardless of what gender they were identified by. They didn't have a choice. So basically what we found here is the industrialism expanding transnationally and globally. And of course, again, for better and worse, it amplified our ability to have access to education, but also a means of financial access and stability, even though, of course, many people that are feminine couldn't open bank accounts until about the 60s. Um, and ultimately, this also created opportunities for people who weren't the Enlightenment subject, so the white cishet male, to get educational access. So the thing to keep in mind, though, is that there were always figures that were non-men in academic spaces running all sorts of hierarchy and bureaucracy. However, they were still being overshadowed by the Enlightenment subject canon. And now there is recently recovery work being done to kind of recover who has been erased and who has been overshadowed. For instance, Rowland and Simonson's project in 2013 talked about the Mothers of Communication, which was 4 aggregates that they created to discuss certain roles, particularly in the field of media and communication, that were overshadowed by the founding fathers of communication. So these were people like secretaries and directors and networkers and other, types of labor that were deemed lesser important than the founding fathers. And this is, of course, something that went on in all types of workforces, not just academics. So most recently, we have neoliberalism. And the thing to understand about neoliberalism is that ultimately it is a philosophical and economic model that not just deregulated, but it also privatized and it corporatized quite literally all spheres of our lives. So it took those already individualized rhetorics of industrial capitalism and it pushed them to the hyper extent, the cult of individualism. It took all of the appeals that were already set in stone and it expedited them. And what Ritzer argued, based off of Weber's work, is that the rationality that was put into place has been pushed into irrationality, or what he called the McDonaldization of life. So he said that this affected all spheres of our lives, including sex. And then lastly, of course, these rhetorics also bled into the way advertising was being structured, and particularly what neoliberalism does, other than prioritize profit over people, is it uses seemingly liberal and useful means of inclusion, but it takes them into a hollow extent where ultimately it seems like every, gay pride month, you'll see corporations put a gay pride flag. However, they don't actually do anything tangibly to change the inequitable social relations. And then, of course, also most recently, too, with the emergence of the internet age and the ability to gather data on all types of users online, this has drastically changed the way advertising is not just capturing our eyes, but capturing our money. So very briefly, just for sake of time, thinking back to the love sync device, I narrowed down 4 ideological and material syncing issues that I think that the device could have been speaking to. First of all, about the fact that only some people in this country have been deemed fully human. Secondly, the amount of rampant violences that go uncriminalized. Thirdly, the amount of judgments, shame, blame, and different isolation factors in general that were normalized on the basis of the first 2. And then, of course, with the emergence of the internet, Web 2.0, and all types of dating profiles, it's drastically changed how we go about meeting people and loving people. And then, of course, the sexopolis. And then the pandemic hit. So although I can't go over any more of the project in this particular presentation, in the overall dissertation, I offer a liberatory embodied new research paradigm. And I echo a lot of critical cultural studies in various fields interdisciplinarily that have in recent years argued that biases are built into systems as features. I also extend a media ecologist from 2014 who argued that humans are also media, extending that into critical cultural studies. And then also I argue that ideologies act as filtering mechanisms. So overall, though, the main argument is that there's been, since the origin of the United States, a mechanization of humans that with the onset of biomimetics and sex robots is flipping into a humanization of objects. And ultimately, my suggestion is that human problems require human solutions. Thanks for listening.